Confucianism is one of the most important intellectual traditions on the planet, offering a system of values and political leadership that dominated imperial China for thousands of years. Its influence extended far beyond China's borders into neighboring regions like Japan, Korea, and even South Asian Chinese communities. But what exactly is Confucianism? Is it a religion, a philosophy, a way of life, a collection of fortune cookie sayings, all of the above? Well, in this video, we'll start to answer that question and dive into the historical and philosophical basics of Confucianism. We'll explore its origins to try and figure out where the Confucian system of values came from. We'll take a look at some of these values in a little bit more detail, and we'll also examine some areas of disagreement among prominent Confucians. Today on Frank Philosophy. So what is Confucianism in a historical sense? Well, in English, it sounds like the name of a school of thought that traces back to a single thinker, like Platonism or Marxism. But this is a bit misleading, because the Chinese term that gets translated as Confucianism is actually Rújiā, which makes no mention of Confucius. Instead, Rújiā literally just means the school of the Rú. But what is a Rú? Well, in the centuries leading up to the time of Confucius, known as the Spring and Autumn period, the Rú were a group of highly educated cultural elites who would advise wealthy families and the rulers of the various Chinese states and provinces on cultural and ritual matters. They were the go-to experts for things like how to arrange a funeral for an important person, or how to perform a ceremony on an important day. And these Rú existed prior to the time of Confucius, and Confucius himself was one of them. But Confucius was unique insofar as he was the first to translate this cultural knowledge into a fully fledged system of values with deep moral significance. He was the first to take what used to be considered a merely technical skill in event management and details of various rituals and turn it into a school of thought or a philosophy. He was the first among the Rú to use this cultural knowledge in instructing the rulers of the day, not just in things like how to arrange a funeral, but also in how to rule in a way that might actually improve the lives of their subjects, instead of just subjecting them to endless miserable oppression, as was the norm during the Warring States period in which Confucius lived. In other words, his goal was to encourage rulers to implement and follow the Tao, or the way. And during his lifetime, he amassed a substantial following of students who sought to learn from him about the way and to go to find rulers of their own that they could advise on how to implement it. Confucius lived from approximately 551 to 479 BCE, and this was a period of tremendous political fragmentation and social upheaval in China. Multiple states were constantly at war with one another, competing over territory and power. In this chaotic context, Confucius saw an opportunity, and really saw it as his goal to restore order and harmony by reviving what he believed to be a golden age of practices of China's ancient early dynasties, specifically the Western Zhou dynasty, which flourished from 1046 to 771 BC. And the idea was that if the rulers of today could implement the practices, or the way, of those ancient, wonderful rulers of the past, then society could achieve social order and prosperity and harmony today, which it desperately needed at the time. Confucius was also unique in that he was one of the first to make a living as a full-time independent teacher. Prior to the time of Confucius, education took place within the homes of wealthy aristocratic families, and knowledge was passed down through hereditary lines. But Confucius was one of the first, and indeed the most successful, of the Rú to make a career out of teaching others how to become a Rú. When he didn't have an official position in government, his students supported him in various ways, allowing him to dedicate himself fully to teaching. This independent support funded Confucius's mobility as he moved throughout the various warring states. He traveled extensively, seeking out rulers who would listen to him and try to implement the Tao, or the way. And they would do this by either listening to him or by giving him a job. According to traditional accounts, Confucius had around 3,000 students throughout his lifetime, and of these, about 72 became particularly accomplished disciples who spread his teachings long after his death. And after his moderately successful career in politics, Confucius retired to his home state of Lu in modern-day Shandong province. There, he spent his final years teaching, and, according to tradition, editing the classical texts that would go on to form the Confucian canon. In the decades and centuries that followed, generations of students would expand upon his teachings to develop a systematic approach to the way, in the hopes of finding rulers who would enact that system and bring society out of the misery and chaos of the warring states period. Eventually, Confucius's vision would be realized in the Han Dynasty, which adopted Confucianism as the official doctrine of the day, and it would go on to dominate imperial China from then onward. So what exactly was Confucius advising these rulers to do? How could they actually implement the Confucian way? Well, one key premise of Confucius's thought, which would go on to influence all subsequent generations of Confucianism, is that morally good rulers would lead to moral goodness throughout the population. And the moral goodness of both the rulers and the ruled would lead to social order and prosperity. Confucius believed that a ruler's virtue has a transformative, almost magnetic ability to bring out the best in people. This happens not merely through their authority, but also through their charisma, and the fact that they set a good moral example that would just naturally inspire people to try and be good like them. Confucius used the metaphor of the wind and the grass to illustrate this point. When the wind blows, the grass bends. When the ruler is good, so too will the people become good. And this stood in stark contrast to the ruling philosophy of Confucius's time, which relied heavily on strict laws and harsh punishments to keep people in line. But Confucius argued that ruling through virtue was far superior to ruling through regulations and punishments. When people are led by regulations and kept in line by punishments, he said, they'll try and avoid punishment and never have any sense of shame. But when they're led by virtue and kept in line by various rituals, they'll develop a sense of shame and become good of their own accord. And again, if the population becomes morally good, especially of its own accord, then, well, society will be peaceful and prosperous. And that's what it means to have a society that follows the way. But what exactly did the Confucian conception of virtue consist in? Well, the Confucians developed a system of specific values or virtues that constitute overall moral goodness. The most important of these are referred to as the 5 constants. The first is ren, translated as benevolence, humaneness, or human-heartedness. This is the supreme virtue in Confucianism, encompassing things like compassion, empathy, and a genuine concern for other people's well-being. The second key virtue is yi, or righteousness, and this refers to moral rightness and the ability to judge what is appropriate in any given situation. It has a bit more to do with obligation than ren does. The third is li, and this means ritual or ritual propriety. And this just refers to having a sense of appropriateness in a ritual setting, including both formal ceremonies and just everyday etiquette that structures social relationships. The fourth is zhi, knowledge or wisdom, which involves moral discernment and practical knowledge, like what to do in a new situation. And the fifth is xin, meaning sincerity or trustworthiness. This is just the quality of being authentic and reliable in one's words and deeds. There's also the golden rule, or reciprocity, which is also prominently featured in Confucian thought. When a student asked Confucius if there was one word that could serve as a guide to all life, Confucius replied, reciprocity, or shu. What you do not wish for yourself, do not do to others. There are some additional values in Confucianism that are more specific, relating to one's various social roles. Confucianism emphasized what we call the 5 relationships: ruler and subject, father and son, husband and wife, older and younger siblings, and friend and friend. Each of these relationships came with specific obligations and virtues. For example, xiao, or filial piety, is the virtue of being a good son or daughter to your parents. This includes not just obedience, but also deep respect, care, and the continuation of the family line. There's also ti, or fraternal respect, which governs the relationships between older and younger siblings. And then there's zhong, or loyalty, which describes the proper relationship between a minister, read employee, and their ruler, or boss. And what's interesting here is that most of the relationships are not symmetrical. They're not rooted in mutual respect among equals. Instead, the Confucians recognized and emphasized that different people have different roles with different responsibilities throughout society, and some roles are just higher ranked than others. Some roles give people more authority than others. And we still all have a role to play within that system. even if it's not perfectly symmetrical. But importantly, both parties in each relationship have obligations. It's not just that children have to obey and respect their parents. Parents also have to care for their children, and rulers have to govern virtuously and care for their subjects. This creates a web of mutual obligations that, when properly fulfilled, produce social harmony. Another thing that Confucianism emphasizes that many philosophers today find really interesting is their focus on ritual, or li. This makes a lot of sense given the origins of Confucianism in the practices of the Rú. And for Confucius, ritual isn't just an empty or mindless tradition. Instead, rituals are carefully structured practices that train us in virtue and help us express our deepest values. Think about how a funeral works, however unpleasant. The ritual structure of a funeral includes things like somber clothing, and specific actions and formal expressions of condolences that you're supposed to do. All of these guide us in expressing our grief appropriately. Now compare that to a wedding, a completely different ceremony with its own color palette and ritual expectations from guests and participants. These rituals remind us how to process our emotions and express them appropriately. And this is a key part of moral development, according to the Confucians. Confucius believed that by practicing rituals, we're really shaping ourselves into better human beings. The outer performance of these rituals gradually cultivates inner virtue. So the idea is that if you want to become benevolent and good, you don't just think benevolent thoughts, you perform actions of a benevolent person until those actions become natural to you. Rituals also serve an important social function. They create shared expectations and common forms of expression that allow people to interact harmoniously. Even a practice as simple as bowing or shaking hands represent morally significant rituals. Doing so expresses respect that serves as the basis of mutual relationships. And when everybody knows how to properly greet one another, how to show respect, how to conduct business, social life just runs more smoothly. Another thing that Confucians heavily emphasized was education. But this didn't mean learning about math and science. Instead, the Confucians emphasized classical learning, basically the study of history and poetry. The Rú would study these classical texts so they could quote them and tell the leaders of the day about their contents. The idea was that these classic sources of wisdom could be used to teach the rulers how to rule well, because, well, it recorded how previous rulers ruled well and poorly, so they could avoid doing that stuff. And most of these records included references to the great deeds of the legendary sage kings of old, like Yao and Shun, as well as to the legendary tyrants. And so education in Confucianism wasn't about memorizing information for its own sake, just to know it. It was more about using the wisdom of the past to serve as a model of becoming an exemplary person, or a great ruler. And Confucius also used these texts to teach his students how to become a good Rú, specifically how to become a gentleman, or a Xunzi. The gentleman, or Xunzi, served as the Confucian paradigmatic moral exemplar among the, well, civilian class. This was the best kind of Rú that you could be, a Xunzi, a gentleman. Nowadays, we translate it as an exemplary person. And Confucius believed that anybody who put in the right amount of work and studied the right texts could become such a person. And this gentlemanly ideal could also serve as a moral exemplar for others. And Confucius's idea that anybody could achieve this ideal was actually pretty radical at the time. The idea that anyone capable could become morally good and get a job in government, influencing society for the better, was really unheard of in a society where most things were determined by lineage, your family, and your aristocratic background. And this innovation was yet another reason why Confucianism was able to spread so widely and become such a dominating intellectual force. Now, so far, this all constitutes the core of Confucian politics and ethics, its core values and practices. And it forms a pretty comprehensive and pretty consistent system. But Confucianism has an almost equally long tradition of disagreement and debate within itself, going all the way back to the time of Confucius's earliest students who disagreed about what the master really meant and things like that. And there are some pretty famous disagreements between pretty prominent Confucians that represented various moments of branching off within this once unified tradition. And this in turn led to a mosaic of different branches of Confucianism representing different interpretations of how the doctrines should be handled and thought about. But what exactly did these Confucians disagree about? The Confucian system of values seems pretty unified, so where's the room for such deep and famous disagreement? Well, the main points of disagreement weren't really about the values of Confucianism. Those were kind of set pretty early on in the tradition's history. Instead, deep disagreement arose about how these values ought to be pursued, the nature of moral cultivation, the various methods of achieving these virtues, and the relationship between these virtues and the natural world and human nature. Essentially, they disagreed over the justification for why people should adopt the Confucian values, not necessarily disagreement about the values themselves. For example, the famous disagreement between Mencius and Xunzi about the goodness or badness of human nature really boiled down to the question of whether or not the Confucian virtues are natural for us or artificially imposed. Mencius lived about a century after Confucius, from approximately 372 to 289 BC. He's often called the second sage of Confucianism. And his famous claim that human nature is good really amounts to the claim that the virtues are a natural extension of our existing moral sentiments and capacities. He argued that everyone had these innate capacities for the Confucian virtues in particular, and the Confucian virtues were just the results of allowing these natural tendencies to come to their full fruition. Xunzi, on the other hand, lived a little bit later than Mencius, from about 310 to 235 BC, and he believed that nature has no inherent moral qualities, and that's nature and human nature. Instead, he believed that moral cultivation was more like a process of crafting a raw material into something useful. Morality was imposed from the outside. It wasn't a natural development of our tendencies. And these two competing models of how to understand the relationship between moral virtue and human nature represented one of Confucianism's earliest disagreements. Later on in the tradition, many different ideas emerged about the relationship between the virtues and the metaphysical structure of reality. So during the Han Dynasty, the philosopher Dong Zhongshu promoted a cosmology according to which the 5 Confucian virtues actually correspond to the 5 fundamental elements of the universe. And this was highly contentious. The philosopher Wang Chong rejected this completely. Even though they were both Confucian and they both lived during the Han Dynasty, they had this deep disagreement that set them apart from one another. Later on during the Song Dynasty, Neo-Confucians like Zhu Xi and Lu Zhuoyan developed various distinct, elaborate metaphysical systems that gave an account of how morality is possible. And their accounts incorporated other metaphysical premises like those that belong to Taoism and Buddhism. But all the while, in spite of all their various disagreements, these figures all remained fundamentally Confucian. They were all committed to the same core values, and they were all committed to the idea of ruling through virtue. They just disagreed about how we ought to pursue that virtue and the relationship between virtue and the natural world and our human nature. So Confucianism is a rich philosophical tradition that emphasizes ruling by virtue, the ethical importance of ritual, classical education, and the pursuit of social harmony. Its philosophical and intellectual content originated with Confucius in the 6th and 5th centuries BC, and then went on to be further developed over the ensuing millennia through the contributions of numerous thinkers. And that's a pretty solid summary of Confucianism, I think. At its core, Confucianism teaches that we can create a better society by cultivating virtue in ourselves and others, particularly among those in positions of power. This cultivation happens through education, ritual practice, and attention to our various social relationships. Understanding Confucianism helps us understand not only Chinese history and culture, but also fundamental questions about ethics, politics, philosophy, and human nature that remain relevant today. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe for more Frank Philosophy.